The letter burned in Stella Monroe's hands like a brand pressed against her skin, and she nearly threw it into the fire before the handwriting stopped her cold. She had torn it open expecting nothing, expecting the same cruel joke that Hector Crane's men had been playing on her for 3 weeks, slipping fake notices under her door, leaving forged documents on her porch to remind her that her time in Redemption Creek was running out. She had expected the clumsy, block-letter printing of an illiterate ranch hand, paid 2 bits to scrawl a threat. She had expected fear, and she had braced herself for it the way she braced herself for everything now, with her jaw set and her eyes dry and her heart locked behind 3 layers of iron will. What she had not expected was this. The handwriting was meticulous. Each letter formed with a deliberate, almost architectural care, the kind of penmanship that took years to develop, that spoke of a man who understood the weight that words could carry. The loops on the lowercase letters were controlled. The capital letters carried a slight leftward lean, barely perceptible, but she knew it. She knew it the way she knew the sound of rain on the tin roof of the house she had grown up in, the way she knew the smell of cedar smoke in winter. She knew this handwriting. Her legs stopped working. She sat down hard on the edge of her bed, the rough quilt bunching beneath her, the letter trembling in fingers that had been steady through every disaster of the last 18 months. Her throat closed. Her eyes moved back to the top of the page and read the first line again. Stella. I know you have every reason to throw this away. Read it anyway. 3 words held her entire world still, because it was impossible. Because Matthew Yates had left Redemption Creek 14 months ago under a cloud of secrets, and a silence so complete she had eventually convinced herself, she had imagined everything between them. Because she had made herself believe that a man that careful, that guarded, that deeply walled off would never write to her, would never find a reason to break the silence he had chosen. And yet here were his words, in his careful hand, sitting in her lap in the winter of 1883 in a one-room house in the New Mexico territory, and Stella Monroe's whole, carefully constructed life without him cracked straight down the center like dry wood. She had to go back. She had to understand how on earth they had arrived here, both of them, at this impossible, terrifying, beautiful moment. Because the letter was only the end of one story and the beginning of another, and if she was going to survive what came next, she needed to remember everything. She needed to remember Matthew Yates. Redemption Creek had not been kind to Stella Monroe from the moment she arrived in the spring of 1882. She had come from Santa Fe on a hired coach with 2 trunks, $43, a land deed her father had pressed into her hands the morning before he died, and absolutely no illusions about the romance of frontier living. Her father, James Monroe, had been a school teacher who invested everything he saved over 30 years into a parcel of land in the New Mexico territory, on the advice of a man who turned out to be a land speculator with a charming smile and crooked books. James Monroe had died of a fever in February without ever seeing the land, without ever knowing whether the deed was worth the paper it was printed on. Stella had come to find out. She was 24 years old. She had taught school herself for 2 years in Santa Fe, which had given her both a deep appreciation for human stubbornness and an immunity to intimidation that most people mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She was simply very, very careful about where she put her trust. Redemption Creek was a town that had organized itself around the cattle trade and around the personality of one man, Hector Crane. Crane was 51 years old in the spring of 1882, heavyset, silver-haired, with the kind of booming confidence that filled a room and pressed against the walls. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, which he called Crane's Reach, and he had decided somewhere in the previous 5 years that he also owned Redemption Creek itself, the feed store, the saloon, 3 of the 4 businesses on Main Street, and he believed the land on either side of the creek that ran behind the town's southern edge, the land that Stella's father had bought. Crane had made no secret of his intention to absorb that parcel when James Monroe died. He had, in fact, sent a man to Santa Fe 2 weeks after the funeral, with a very polite letter offering Stella a sum of money to surrender the deed. Stella had read the letter twice, noted that the sum was roughly 1/4 of the land's actual value, and written back a brief, courteous refusal. She had then packed her trunks and made arrangements for the coach. She arrived in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday in late April, when the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first pale green leaves, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only existed in the high desert in spring. She stepped off the coach, arranged for her trunks to be carried to the boarding house, and walked directly to the county land office to file the deed. The land office was operated by a man named Tom Ridley, who was thin and nervous and sweated through his shirt even in mild weather. He took Stella's deed, examined it at length, and then told her there was a complication. There was always a complication, Stella had learned, when Hector Crane was involved. The complication was a second deed. A deed that had apparently been filed 6 months after her father's purchase, also claiming the same parcel, bearing the name of a man called Gerald Oates who, Tom Ridley explained carefully, was Hector Crane's brother-in-law. Stella had looked at the second deed for a long moment. She had looked at Tom Ridley for another long moment, noting the way his eyes kept sliding toward the window. She had thanked him politely, made a copy of both documents in her own hand, and left. She needed a lawyer. What she found, instead, was Matthew Yates. He was not easy to find in the sense that he was not the kind of man who advertised his presence. She heard about him from Mrs. Clara Hutchins, the widow who ran the boarding house, a woman of 60 who had survived a great deal and had opinions about all of it. Matthew Yates, Clara said, had arrived in Redemption Creek the previous autumn. He had set up a small office on the far end of Main Street, in a building that had previously been a harness shop. He had a law degree from a college back east. Clara believed it was in Ohio, though she admitted she was not certain, and he had a reputation for being honest, which Clara said as though it were a mild defect, something that needed to be managed carefully. He also, Clara said, lowering her voice, had a reputation for being the one man in Redemption Creek who had thus far refused every overture from Hector Crane, which was either very brave or very foolish, and Clara had not yet decided which. Stella decided she would find out for herself. She found the office on a Wednesday morning, a narrow building wedged between a closed-up dress shop and a general goods store. The sign on the door said in plain black letters, M. Yates, attorney at law. She knocked. There was a pause, the kind of pause that suggested someone was deciding something. Then, come in. Matthew Yates was sitting behind a desk that was covered in organized stacks of paper, which told her something immediately. Disorganized papers meant a disorganized mind. Organized papers meant someone who understood that information was a tool and treated it accordingly. He was tall even sitting down, she could tell by the proportions, by the way his shoulders filled the chair. He was 30 years old, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mesas outside town, and dark eyes that assessed her with a directness that most men reserved for other men. He was not conventionally handsome in the soft, easy way that made women simper. He was handsome in the more difficult way, the way that required you to look at him for a while before you understood it, and then once you understood it you could not stop seeing it. He did not stand up immediately, which also told her something. He was not performing courtesy. He was looking at the deed she had placed on his desk with genuine attention. "Sit down," he said. "Thank you," she said, and sat. They spent the next 2 hours going over both deeds. Matthew Yates read every word. He asked her questions, precise, specific questions about the timeline of her father's purchase, about the land speculator's name, about whether any payments had been witnessed. His handwriting, as he took notes, was that careful, deliberate script she would not fully register until much later. He had a way of holding the pen that suggested he had been taught to treat it as a serious instrument. At the end of 2 hours, he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those direct, dark eyes, and he said, "Your deed is valid. The second deed is fraudulent. I can prove it in a territorial court, but it will take time, and Crane will make your life extremely uncomfortable while we wait." "He's already started," Stella said. A corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was more like a recognition. "Then you'll need to decide if the land is worth it." "My father invested everything he had in that land," Stella said. "He never got to see it. He trusted a man he shouldn't have trusted, and he paid for it with everything. I'm not going to let the next man who wants to steal from him succeed where the first one failed." Matthew Yates was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in those dark eyes, something she could not name yet, would not be able to name for months. "All right," he said. "Then let's build a case." It was not a romance, not at first. It was a working partnership, conducted across the narrow desk in his harness shop office, surrounded by case documents and land records and the careful accumulation of evidence. Stella was a good researcher. Her years of teaching had made her comfortable with close reading and logical argument, and Matthew used her well, giving her specific tasks, explaining exactly what he needed and why. He was not condescending. He did not explain things she already understood or repeat himself unnecessarily. He listened when she made an observation. If her observation was wrong, he said so, but he said it in a way that left her dignity intact. She appreciated all of this. She would have appreciated it in anyone. The fact that she also noticed the way he moved, deliberate and economical, never a wasted gesture, and the way he listened to her as though she were the only person in the room, and the way he occasionally forgot to maintain his professional reserve and let something genuinely warm surface in his expression for just a second before he caught himself, all of that was something she kept very private. Because she had not come to Redemption Creek for a man. She had come for her father's land. Hector Crane's interference escalated through May and into June. He sent his ranch foreman, a broad man named Dale Mosher, to visit Stella at the boarding house with a second offer, this one somewhat more generous, which Stella declined with the same courteous brevity as the first. He had two of his men ride slowly past the land parcel while she was walking it with Matthew, which was meant to be threatening, and which she chose to treat as a coincidence, loudly and cheerfully, until they rode away. Matthew said, walking back toward town after the riders had gone, "You're not afraid of him." "I'm afraid of him," Stella corrected. "I'm choosing not to show it. There's a difference." He looked at her sideways in that measuring way he had. "There is," he agreed. And then, after a pause, "Most people can't hold that distinction when they're frightened." "I've had practice," she said, and did not elaborate, and he did not press, which was another thing she filed away. By July they had found it, the piece of evidence that made everything else fall into place. It was in the Territorial Records office in the county seat, a day's ride from Redemption Creek. Matthew had gone himself, alone, and come back with a document that showed the notary stamp on the second deed. Gerald Oates' deed had been issued by a notary whose license had expired 14 months before the deed was supposedly filed. The date was wrong. The deed was not just fraudulent, it was sloppily fraudulent, and Matthew had the paperwork to prove it. He came to tell her that evening, arriving at the boarding house at 7 o'clock, which was unusual enough that Clara Hutchins raised an eyebrow and then made herself scarce with the particular tactfulness of a woman who had seen a great many things in her years. He stood in the small sitting room and told Stella what he had found, and she sat and listened. And when he finished, she put her hands over her face and breathed for a moment because she had been holding on so tightly for so long that the first loosening of tension was almost painful. "We can file next week," he said. "I'll go before Judge Hartwell in Las Cruces. Crane doesn't have any influence with Hartwell, the judge is federal appointed. This is going to work, Stella." She looked up at the sound of her name. He almost never used it. He had a way of constructing conversation so that names were rarely necessary, and she had not decided whether this was deliberate or simply his natural style. The sound of it in his voice did something she was not entirely prepared for. "Thank you," she said. "Matthew." The pause that followed was a fraction too long to be casual. His expression did what it sometimes did, reach the edge of something warmer and then pulled back, carefully, like a man stepping away from a ledge he had not intended to approach. "I'll have the papers ready by Friday," he said, and left. The filing went forward. The case was set for September. And in the 2 months between, something shifted between them so gradually and so inevitably that Stella could not have identified the exact moment it began. Only that by late August, when they were sitting in his office on a warm evening with the window open and the sound of the creek drifting in, and he had read her something from the legal brief, and she had laughed at a particular turn of phrase, and he had looked at her laughing with an expression that was not guarded at all, not even a little, she knew. She knew the same way she had known her father's fever was serious before the doctor said so. The same way she had known the speculator's deed was fraudulent before she had proof. She knew with the same bone-deep certainty that Matthew Yates was in love with her and had been for some time, and that he was terrified of it. She was not going to press. She had her own kind of terror to manage. But she let herself know it privately and held the knowledge the way you held a small, warm thing carefully with both hands. And then September came and the trial, and everything broke open. The trial before Judge Hartwell went 4 days. Matthew was brilliant in it, calm, precise, methodical, building his case like a structure that couldn't be knocked down. Stella sat in the gallery and watched him work and understood, for the first time, exactly what he had been made for. This was not a man who had accidentally become a lawyer. This was a man whose particular mind, organized, logical, patient, absolutely relentless, had found its perfect tool. Gerald Oates' attorney, a man named Prescott brought in from Albuquerque and paid for by Hector Crane, was good. He was very good. But he did not have Matthew's fact, and facts, Judge Hartwell made clear, were what mattered in his courtroom. On the 4th day, Judge Hartwell ruled in Stella's favor. The fraudulent deed was invalidated. The land was confirmed as the sole property of the Monroe estate, meaning Stella Monroe. Redemption Creek found out by nightfall. The reaction was split cleanly between the people who worked for Crane and the people who didn't, and for 24 hours the tension in town was a living thing, thick and sharp. But Crane was not a stupid man. He was calculating and patient, and he understood when to absorb a loss and wait for a different angle. He waited. And Stella was careful, and Matthew was careful, and for 3 weeks after the trial everything was quiet. The night it stopped being quiet, it was October, and the air had the first edge of cold in it, and Stella had just come back from walking the land with a notebook, making plans, fencing, water, the small house she intended to build before winter closed in. She came back to the boarding house to find Matthew waiting for her on the porch, and his face was wrong. "What happened?" she said immediately. "Walk with me," he said. They walked to the far end of town, away from the windows of the saloon, and he told her what he had found out that afternoon. Hector Crane had engaged a different kind of legal strategy, not to contest her deed again, which he couldn't, but to build a case that Matthew himself had violated professional ethics in obtaining the notary records. It was fabricated, completely fabricated, but it was the kind of charge that could drag through a professional review board for a year and cost Matthew his license in the interim. Crane had connections with the Territorial Bar Association. He had money. He was prepared to use both. "He's targeting you because of me," Stella said. The guilt was immediate and physical. "He's targeting me because I won," Matthew said with the particular flatness that meant he was controlling something strong. "Don't make it about you. It isn't." "Matthew, it isn't," he said again, more quietly. "But I need you to understand that this could get complicated, for both of us. And I need you to know," he stopped. She waited. The silence stretched between them in the October dark, and she could feel everything he wasn't saying pressing against the edges of it. "I need you to know that I don't regret any of it," he said finally. "The case, any of it." She understood that he meant more than the case. She also understood that he was not going to say more than that, not tonight, because something was holding him back that had nothing to do with Hector Crane and everything to do with whatever lived in his dark past that he had never shown her. She made a decision. "Come to dinner tomorrow," she said. "Clara always makes too much on Thursdays." He blinked. The controlled surface rippled. "Dinner." "It's a meal," she said, with just enough lightness to make it safe for him. "Thursday, 6 o'clock, unless you have an objection." Something crossed his face that was complicated and tender and a little desperate. "No objection," he said. He came to dinner on Thursday. He came the Thursday after that, and the one after that. Clara Hutchins observed these developments with immense satisfaction and absolute discretion. She set extra places without comment, and provided excellent food, and found reasons to be elsewhere when the conversation at the table stretched past 9 o'clock. It was during these Thursday dinners that Stella learned who Matthew Yates actually was, in the careful, unhurried way that he revealed things, never in a rush, never in a flood, but steadily, piece by piece, like a man unsure of the architecture he was building but committed to laying each stone honestly. He had grown up in Ohio, in a town outside of Columbus. His father had been a circuit judge, which explained the handwriting and the formal education and the particular way he held himself, as though he expected to be called upon to justify his position at any moment. He had an older brother named Daniel who had gone into business and two younger sisters he clearly adored, based on the way his expression softened when he mentioned them. He had studied law in Columbus and then in the East in a program in Philadelphia, and he had come west 3 years ago. "Why west?" she asked one evening. He was quiet for a moment. "There was a situation," he said. "In Philadelphia, a case." She did not push. She had learned the exact dimensions of his silences by then, which ones were just him thinking, and which ones meant a door he was not ready to open. This was the latter. She let it be. But she came to understand over those weeks of Thursdays that whatever had happened in Philadelphia had cost him something significant. Not his license, that was intact. Something else. Something in the category of trust or faith or the particular hope that the law and justice were reliably the same thing. He had come west, she thought, to rebuild that faith in a place where the connections were simpler and the need was clearer. He had found, instead, Hector Crane. The ethics complaint moved forward in November. Matthew fought it through official channels, letters, affidavits, documentation, with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. Stella helped where she could. She also started building her house, because she refused to let Crane's campaign against Matthew make her feel like she had less right to the land her father had paid for. The house was small, one main room and a sleeping loft, built by two men from town who were handy with timber and needed the work. Matthew came out on the weekends to check progress, and stayed longer than checking progress required, and helped when he could be useful. And one afternoon in November, when the framing was up and the roof boards were going on, Stella came around the side of the structure and found him at the top of a ladder doing something precise and careful with a corner joint that the builders had rushed. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, not looking down. She stood and watched him fix the joint with the same exactness he brought to everything, and the afternoon light was golden and the air smelled of fresh-cut pine, and she thought, "I am in serious trouble." The ethics complaint was dismissed in late November when the 3 affidavits Matthew had obtained from county officials in Las Cruces demonstrated clearly that the notary records had been accessed through entirely proper channels. Crane had miscalculated. He had assumed Matthew's reputation was thinner than it was. He had assumed that a man who had been in Redemption Creek for only a year would have shallow roots. He had not accounted for the fact that a man of Matthew Yates' particular character built solid foundations quickly. The dismissal should have been the end of the threat. It was not. The week before Christmas, Stella came home from the land to find her front door standing open. She had moved into the house 2 weeks earlier. It was far from finished, lacking proper insulation, and most of the furniture she intended to acquire, but it was hers and it was solid. The open door made her throat tighten. She went in carefully. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged. But on the table she had pushed against the wall, the only furniture she currently owned besides a cot and a trunk, there was a document. She picked it up and read it. It was a notice. Formal, legal-looking. It claimed that her deed had an additional defect, a defect in the original survey, which allegedly placed the eastern boundary of the Monroe parcel inside the right-of-way of a proposed rail line, meaning the parcel was subject to eminent domain proceedings by the territorial government. Stella looked at the document for a long time. Then she went to find Matthew. He read the notice with a stillness that was more alarming than anger would have been. Then he set it down and said, "This is different." "How different?" she asked. "Crane found a new angle," he said. "He's not attacking your deed directly anymore. He's attacking the underlying survey. And if there's a rail line involved, even a proposed one, it goes federal." The rail line, Matthew discovered over the following 2 weeks, was real. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was indeed considering an extension of their line southward through the territory, and the proposed route did pass through the general area of her land parcel. The survey defect claim, however, was manufactured. It was based on a misreading of the survey data that was either deliberate or incompetent, and Matthew believed it was the former. But this required a different kind of fight, a federal fight. And it required someone with connections in the territorial government in Santa Fe who could verify the actual survey records before Crane could have them altered. Matthew had one such contact, a man named Wilson Aldridge, a surveyor who had worked for the Territorial Land Office for 20 years and who owed Matthew a professional favor from a previous matter. Contacting Aldridge required Matthew to travel to Santa Fe, which would take a week, and would leave Stella alone in her half-finished house on the edge of town with Crane's men increasingly present in their visible surveillance. They sat across from each other at her table. She had acquired a second chair by then, and talked through it on a Sunday evening in December with the wind outside making the not-yet-chinked walls whisper. "Go," she said. "I'll be fine. Crane's men have been past your property twice this week." "They're trying to frighten me," she said. "It's working, but I'm not going to let it change my decisions." He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued deeply by now, the one that was full of things he had not said. "I don't like leaving you here." "I'll stay at Clara's while you're gone," she said. "Clara could frighten a mountain lion. I'll be perfectly safe." Something moved in his face. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers for just a moment, warm, certain, and brief, and then he withdrew it with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. "I'll be back in a week," he said. He left on Monday morning. He was back in 5 days. He came back with everything they needed, Aldridge's certified copy of the original survey, which confirmed unambiguously that the Monroe parcel's eastern boundary was 40 feet west of the proposed rail right-of-way, with no overlap whatsoever. The notice Crane had delivered to her house was based on falsified coordinates. Matthew had the proof. He also came back different. Not dramatically different, nothing obvious. But Stella knew his face well enough by then to see the thing that had settled in it. Something decided, something resolved. He came straight to Clara's boarding house from the livery stable, still wearing his road coat. Clara, exercising her remarkable instinct for exit, took herself immediately to the kitchen. Matthew sat down across from Stella at the parlor table and put the documents between them and explained what he had. Then he looked at her and said, "There's something I need to tell you." She felt her heart do something complicated. "All right. The situation in Philadelphia," he said. "The reason I came west." She waited. "I had a client," he said, "a woman named Ruth Hale. She was fighting a property dispute, her family's land, claimed fraudulently by a business consortium. I built the case. I believed it was solid." He stopped for a moment and looked at the documents on the table rather than at her. The consortium had a connection with a member of the Bar Association in Philadelphia, Before we got to trial, my client was pressured financially, socially, in ways I couldn't protect her from. She settled. She accepted a fraction of what the land was worth. That wasn't your failure, Stella said. I know, he said. I know that intellectually. But I had promised her we would win, and I had believed it completely, and when the outside pressure did what no legal argument could do, he stopped again. I lost faith in my own judgment, in my ability to protect the people who trusted me. Stella was very still. I came west because I thought smaller town, simpler fights, smaller stakes. His mouth curved slightly at his own naivety, and I found Hector Crane. And me, she said. And you, he said, and looked at her directly for the first time since he'd begun. And I have spent the last 6 months being terrified that history is going to repeat itself, that I'm going to promise you this land and then watch someone take it from you anyway. You haven't promised me anything, she said gently. You've helped me fight for what's mine. Those are different things. I'm going to promise you something now, he said, and his voice had changed lower, more certain, stripped of the professional layer he kept over everything. Not about the land, about something else. The wind had stopped outside. The room was very quiet. I've been in love with you, he said, since approximately the 3rd week of April, when you told me your father trusted the wrong man and you were not going to let the next man succeed where the first one failed. I have been trying to avoid telling you this for a number of reasons, most of which seem considerably less important than they did 6 months ago. Stella breathed. What changed? She asked. 5 days in Santa Fe, he said, thinking about what I was coming back to, who I was coming back to. He paused. You. She looked at him across the table, across the documents that represented everything she had fought for, across the months of Thursdays and the half-built house and the careful, bone-deep process of coming to know and trust another human being, and she said, I have been in love with you for very nearly as long. He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the guard was entirely gone, and what she saw was just him, Matthew Yates, 30 years old, brilliant and guarded and frightened and steady, looking at her with everything he had. He stood up. She stood up. They met in the middle of the small parlor, and he put his hands on her face, those careful hands, and kissed her, and it was not tentative at all. It was the kiss of someone who had been certain for a very long time and had finally given himself permission. Clara Hutchins, from the kitchen, was heard to loudly begin washing dishes with great enthusiasm and no apparent awareness of anything else. January of 1883 was bitterly cold and full of the particular happiness of two people who had waited a long time for something they had not entirely let themselves want. Matthew filed the response to the rail survey claim in the 2nd week of the month. He and Stella were formally keeping company, which in Redemption Creek in 1883 meant that he walked her home from the boarding house each evening, and that their Thursday dinners had become a settled institution, and that Clara Hutchins had begun embroidering a tablecloth with an air of purposeful investment in the outcome. Crane's response to the filing was to do nothing visible for 3 weeks, which was, Matthew explained, more alarming than visible action. A man like Crane went quiet when he was building something. He was building something. They found out what it was in the last week of January. Crane had bought the general goods store. The store was owned by a man named Pete Calloway, who had been operating on thin margins and had accepted Crane's offer because he needed to keep his family fed. No one blamed Pete Calloway, but the store was the only general goods establishment within 20 miles, and in a town that depended on it for basic supplies, Crane's ownership of it was a lever he had not had before, and he used it almost immediately. The families who had testified in support of Stella's original case, 3 families who had provided character statements about the Monroe deed's legitimacy, suddenly found their credit at the store cut off. Not publicly, not with any stated reason. Just cut off quietly in the way that power operated when it did not need to show itself. Stella found out on a Thursday when she went to the store for flour and overheard a whispered conversation between 2 women who stopped when they saw her. She put her purchases back and went straight to Matthew's office. "He's punishing people for helping me," she said. Matthew listened. His jaw was tight by the time she finished. "He's trying to isolate you," he said. "Cut off your support in town." "He's succeeding," she said. "Those families have children. They can't afford to be cut off from their supplies because of my land." "I know." They looked at each other. She could see the thing he was weighing: the case, the progress they had made, her safety, the people being hurt around her, the long calculus of it. "What if I sold?" she said. The words cost her something physical to say. Matthew went very still. "Stella, not to Crane. I'd never sell to Crane. But what if I sold to someone else? Use the proceeds to help the families he's harassing." She paused. "My father bought that land as an investment. He never intended to live here. Maybe the way I honor what he built isn't by holding the land forever, but by using it to do something good." "You don't have to sacrifice what's yours to protect people Crane is weaponizing," Matthew said, and his voice had an edge she had not heard before. "That's exactly what he wants for the cost of keeping it to feel too high." "I know that," she said. "I'm not selling, I'm thinking out loud." "Think out loud more often," he said, and something in his tone eased. "I like hearing you think." She looked at him and felt again that helpless warmth she had given up trying to contain. "We'll deal with Crane's store tactic the same way we've dealt with everything else," she said, "with patience and evidence and not letting him see that it's working." "Agreed," he said. "And then, stay here." She blinked. "Sorry. Don't go back to Clara's tonight. Stay here in the office." He paused, and a slight color rose in his face that she found entirely endearing. "I'll take the boarding house. You'll be safer here. The lock is better." She understood what he was actually saying, that he was frightened for her in a way he was not ready to articulate, and this was the form it was taking. "All right," she said, and did not make it more than it was. She slept on the narrow cot he kept in the back room for late nights, under his spare coat because he insisted, and in the morning he came back with coffee and bread from the bakery, and they sat in the early light and planned what to do about the store. What they did about the store was, in retrospect, the smartest thing either of them had ever done. Matthew sent letters, 3 letters precisely composed, to 3 different journalists, one in Albuquerque, one in Santa Fe, one in El Paso. Each letter outlined, with careful specificity, the pattern of Hector Crane's behavior in Redemption Creek, the fraudulent deed, the fabricated ethics complaint, the manufactured survey data, and now the coercive use of commercial control to punish families for their civic participation in a legal proceeding. He did not overstate anything. He did not ask for anything in particular. He simply laid out the facts and let the journalists draw their own conclusions. 2 of the 3 printed something. The Albuquerque piece ran in the first week of February. The Santa Fe piece ran a week later. They were not dramatic. They were factual, precise accounts of what Matthew had laid out. But they reached people that Hector Crane needed to remain comfortable with his reputation: territorial politicians, business investors, the kind of people who preferred their associates not to appear in newspaper accounts of fraudulent deeds and commercial coercion. Crane felt it. He did not show it, not publicly, but Matthew had a source, a man named Avery who worked at the telegraph office and had his own reasons for disliking Crane, who told them that the number of telegrams coming into and going out of Crane's reach had tripled in February. March came, and the territorial decision on the rail survey claim came with it. The decision was in Stella's favor. The Monroe parcel's eastern boundary was confirmed unambiguously. The eminent domain claim was dismissed. The land was hers fully and finally, with no remaining legal challenge. Matthew told her in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, and she sat with the news for a full minute before she said anything. "Is it over?" she asked. "The legal fight is over," he said carefully. "Crane may still try something. He's not a man who accepts losses gracefully. But the land is mine. The land is yours," she breathed. "My father would have been glad," she said. Her voice was steady but only just. Matthew crossed from behind his desk and sat in the chair beside her, not behind the professional barrier of the desk but beside her, and took her hand and held it and said nothing. because there was nothing to say and he understood that perfectly. They sat like that for a long time in the afternoon light, and it was perhaps the most intimate moment they had yet shared, which, given everything that had passed between them, was saying something considerable. It should have been the ending. In a different story and a tidier kind of life it would have been. They had won. The land was safe. Crane had been checked. Matthew and Stella were in love and had said so, and the world was a reasonable place. But Hector Crane had one more move. It came in the form of a man named Reed Calloway, not related to Pete Calloway of the general store, just the same surname, a coincidence that Redemption Creek found confusing. Reed Calloway was a drifter of about 40 who showed up in town in late March and took a room at the less reputable of the two boarding houses and began spending time at Crane's saloon. He was quiet and unremarkable, and stayed exactly long enough for no one to think much about him. Then, in the first week of April, 1 year almost to the day since Stella had stepped off the coach in Redemption Creek, a fire started in the back of Matthew's office building at 2 in the morning. Matthew was not in the office. He was at Clara's, where he had taken the room that Stella had vacated when she moved to her house. The fire destroyed the back room and part of the main office before the bucket brigade organized by the townspeople got it under control. The front section of the building was damaged but standing. The desk was gone. Most of the case files, carefully duplicated and stored at the county seat at Matthew's insistence, survived. Reed Calloway was gone from town the morning after the fire. So was Hector Crane, who had ridden out the previous afternoon to visit a cattle operation 2 counties away, giving himself an obvious alibi. Matthew stood in the ruins of his office on an April morning, looking at the damage, and Stella stood beside him. His face was controlled in the way it got when he was very angry, not cold, but pressed flat, every muscle held deliberately still. "He's trying to tell you to leave," she said. "I know what he's doing," Matthew said. "Are you going to leave?" She asked it directly, because she needed to know, because whatever happened next depended on his answer and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He turned from the ruined office and looked at her. The spring sunlight was strong and direct, and it lit his face clearly and she could see everything in it, the anger and the fear and the grief for his burned work, and underneath all of it, bedrock solid, something that was not going anywhere. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I'm going to rebuild. And then I'm going to marry you, if you'll have me. And we are going to build something on your father's land that Hector Crane is going to have to look at every day for the rest of his miserable life." The proposal was not romantic in the conventional sense. He was covered in ash and his jaw was tight and his voice had that controlled anger flatness. But it was the most Matthew Yates proposal that had ever been made in the history of proposals, and Stella Monroe felt it in every part of her. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." A breath left him that had been held for what seemed like a very long time. "Obviously," he agreed, and something in his face opened relief and joy and the particular expression of a man who has been afraid of something precious and is now holding it safely. He crossed the distance between them and kissed her in the ash and April sunlight with his hands in her hair and everything in his posture that had been rigid for months going warm. Clara Hutchins, who had come to survey the fire damage with the rest of the town, turned to Mrs. Peterson from the bakery and said, finally, with such force that Mrs. Peterson's hat moved, "Now, here is where the letter enters." Because the letter, burned in Stella's hands that winter evening of 1883, was not as she had initially, terrifyingly assumed, a mistake or a threat or another of Crane's instruments of pressure. It had arrived in November, 8 months after the fire and the proposal, in the middle of a period that was complicated in ways she had not shared with Matthew. They were engaged. The engagement was known in town and welcomed by the people who mattered to them. Matthew had rebuilt his office, better this time, with a proper stove and better locks and a fireproof iron cabinet for documents. The house on the Monroe land had been fully finished over the summer, properly insulated and furnished, with a proper kitchen stove and 2 real rooms downstairs and the sleeping loft above, and Stella was living in it alone because they were not yet married and she would not have arranged it otherwise, and Matthew respected this completely. The legal matters were, as he had said, finished. The land was hers. Crane had withdrawn, publicly and without acknowledgement, from his various campaigns. The store had eventually had its commercial coercion quietly undone, because the newspaper coverage had made it a political liability. Redemption Creek had settled. But Matthew had been different since October. Not cold, not distant, still present for their Thursday dinners, still walking her home in the evenings, still writing her notes, and this was the thing. This was the key to everything, those notes he had taken to leaving for her when he had a thought he wanted to share but couldn't get to her immediately. Brief, precise notes, in that careful handwriting she had come to know intimately. But in October something had become guarded again in his eyes. Something he wasn't telling her. She had asked twice, gently, and he had said he was fine, he was just working through something, he would tell her when he was ready. She had given him the space he asked for, because she trusted him, and because she had promised herself she would not demand openness on a schedule. But the days passed, and he said nothing, and his eyes kept their secret, and Stella's old instinct for bracing herself against fear, against loss, against the assumption that good things were temporary began to quietly reassert itself. And then the letter arrived. It came with the regular mail, dropped through the slot of her door by the postmaster's boy. She almost didn't open it because the envelope had no return address and the front simply said Stella Monroe in block print, not Matthew's careful script, and she thought it was another of Crane's things, though Crane had been quiet for months. She opened it expecting nothing, and the paper inside was covered in Matthew's handwriting, his careful, architectural, deliberate handwriting that she would have known anywhere on earth. She sat on the edge of her bed and read, "Stella, I know you have every reason to throw this away. Read it anyway. I have been trying to find a way to tell you something for 6 weeks, and every time I begin the conversation, I find the words failing me in a way they almost never do. So I am writing it down, because I have always been better with written words than spoken ones, and because you deserve the full truth, even when the full truth is complicated, and involves a part of my history that I would have preferred to present to you differently. In Philadelphia, the case I told you about Ruth Hale, I told you about the settlement. I did not tell you everything about the period that followed. There was a woman involved. Her name was Caroline. She was the daughter of one of the attorneys on the opposing side, and I did not know this when I met her. What I am trying to tell you is that I made choices in that period, in the aftermath of losing that case, that I am not proud of. I was not in a relationship with anyone at the time, so there is no question of betrayal in that sense. But I was not, in that period, the person I would want to be. I am telling you this because I have learned that secrets in a foundation make a weak structure, and I want what we are building to be solid. I want you to know the version of me that came to Redemption Creek, not just the version that arrived, but the one that carried all his history with him. There is one other thing. Caroline, I have reason to believe she is going to come to Redemption Creek. Her father's firm has been engaged by a new business interest in the territory. I do not know if this is coincidence or not. I want you to hear it from me first. I love you. I should have said this years ago in Philadelphia about a completely different person, and I didn't, and it cost me things I have already told you about. I am not going to let my fear of the wrong moment stop me from saying the right thing again. I am yours entirely if you will still have me. The choice is yours to make with the full truth in front of you. Matthew. Stella read the letter 3 times. Then she sat for a long while in the November evening with the sound of the wind and the far-off noise of the creek, and she thought about betrayal and hidden pasts, and the particular courage it took for a man like Matthew Yates, a man who kept everything organized and controlled and accounted for, to put his worst chapter down on paper and send it to the person he loved most. She thought about the letter arriving in an unmarked envelope, in block print she didn't recognize, and how close she had come to throwing it away. She thought about the moment she had unfolded the paper and seen his handwriting and felt the floor shift beneath her, not in fear. She understood now, but in something more complex. She put on her coat. She walked the half-mile from her house to the edge of town, through the November dark, and knocked on the door of Matthew's rebuilt office, where she knew he would be because he was always there late on Thursdays when he had a brief to finish. He opened the door and saw her face and went very still. "Come in," he said. She came in. She set the letter on his desk between them, his words in his hand, on the paper she had folded and unfolded 3 times already. "I recognized your handwriting," she said. "The block print on the outside confused me. I almost threw it away." He looked at the letter on the desk and then at her. His face was completely open, no guard, no control, just whatever he was feeling visible in every line of it. "I changed the envelope at the last moment," he said. "I was afraid if you saw my writing on the outside, you might not open it," which was the opposite of rational. "Deeply irrational," she agreed gently. "I know, Matthew." She waited until he met her eyes. "I have known since approximately the second Thursday dinner that you had a past you were afraid to show me. I'm not naive enough to think that anyone arrives at 30 years old without scars. Mine are just organized differently. Caroline is— I don't care about Caroline," she said. "What I care about is what you said at the end of that letter." He was silent. "Say it again," she said. "Not on paper, here." Something in him shifted the last wall, the one he had built specifically against this, against the risk of loving someone who knew all of him. It came down with the quiet certainty of something that had been leaning for a long time. "I am yours," he said, "entirely, if you'll have me." "I'll have you," she said. "I've been planning to have you since July, when you came back from Las Cruces and said my name like that. I was just waiting for you to catch up." He laughed. She had heard him laugh before, rare, genuine, the thing that transformed his face entirely, but never quite like this, never with this particular quality of relief and joy combined, and she thought she would spend a considerable amount of energy for the rest of her life making sure she heard it as often as possible. He stood up from the desk and came around it and put his arms around her with a warmth and completeness that was different from every embrace before it, because there was nothing held back anymore, nothing in reserve. Just him, all of him, holding her. "I love you," he said quietly against her hair. "I need to be better at saying that out loud." "You write it beautifully," she said. "But yes, say it out loud too." "I love you," he said again, more easily this time. "Good," she said. "Keep practicing." Caroline arrived in Redemption Creek in the following week, and she was nothing like Stella had expected. She had expected someone soft or calculating or beautiful in a threatening way. Caroline Prescott. Her father was the attorney Crane had used during the trial, which connected everything neatly in a way that made Matthew close his eyes briefly. When Stella pointed it out, was in fact a quiet, self-contained woman of about 26, who was clearly in Redemption Creek for her own reasons entirely, and who registered Matthew's presence with the composure of someone who had thoroughly made peace with a closed chapter. She also had a husband, a railroad engineer named Thomas, who arrived 2 days after she did, and who shook Matthew's hand with complete indifference and asked him about the best livery stable in town. Matthew and Stella stood on Main Street watching Thomas and Caroline walk away toward the hotel, and Matthew said very quietly, "I genuinely did not know about the husband." "I can see that," Stella said, and took his arm and felt the tension leave his shoulder as she did. "Are you laughing at me?" he said. "Only a little," she said, and very lovingly. They were married in December of 1883, 14 months after Stella had stepped off a coach with her father's deed and 2 trunks and $43. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Redemption Creek on his monthly rounds, in the main room of the boarding house because Clara Hutchins had simply announced that this was where it would be held, and no one had thought to disagree with her. It was not a large ceremony. There were perhaps 20 people present, the families who had stood with Stella during the legal fight. Tom Ridley from the land office, who had grown considerably more courageous over the preceding year. Avery from the telegraph office. the two men who had built Stella's house and who were clearly very pleased about it. Pete Calloway from the store came with his wife and 3 children. Clara, of course, was there, wearing the new dress she had mentioned making for the occasion in approximately September. Matthew wore his good suit, which he had pressed very carefully, and had done something with his hair that suggested he had thought about it longer than he would admit. Stella wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, not a wedding dress exactly, but a dress she had made to last, which she considered the same thing. She had flowers from Clara's kitchen garden, dried and tied with ribbon, because December in New Mexico did not offer fresh ones. When the preacher asked Matthew if he took Stella Monroe to be his wife, Matthew said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet and absolutely certain, and Stella found that the answer made her eyes do something she had not anticipated, which was embarrassing and also wonderful. When she said her own, "I do," Matthew's face did the thing she loved most, that complete unguarded expression that was just him, just joy. And she understood that she was going to be looking at that face for the rest of her life and was deeply, completely glad. Clara Hutchins cried openly and made no apology for it. They spent the first year of their marriage in a state of busy happiness that Stella later thought of as the building year, because that was what it was. The house on her father's land was expanded through the spring and summer. Another bedroom, a proper porch along the south side, a root cellar dug behind the house that winter provisioning had made clearly necessary. Matthew moved his office into a spare room on the ground floor of the house 3 days a week, which meant that on those days Stella could hear his pen moving while she worked in the kitchen, and she found this so deeply comfortable that she occasionally had to stop what she was doing and simply appreciate it. He had clients. More than he had expected. There were people in the territory who had been waiting for someone trustworthy to represent them in land and business matters, and word had spread about what he had done for Stella, and for the families Crane had tried to squeeze. He was not getting rich, but they were not in want, and the Monroe land, which they had decided to run cattle on in a modest way, with a small hired crew of 2, was starting to generate income. Hector Crane remained in Redemption Creek through 1884. He had gone quiet, in the way that large, self-important things go quiet when they have been publicly checked, not gone, not harmless, but no longer actively moving. He sold the general goods store back to Pete Calloway in March, at a loss, which everyone understood to be the last piece of his retreat from the strategy that had failed. He rode past the Monroe land on occasion, and once he stopped his horse on the road and looked at the house for a long moment before riding on. Matthew saw this from the porch. He did not go inside or move or give any sign that it concerned him. Crane left Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1884. He sold Crane's Reach to a cattle consortium from Texas, the kind of large, faceless business entity that had no personality and no agenda beyond profit, and relocated to Santa Fe, where Tom Ridley reported with great satisfaction. He had apparently purchased a modest house and was attempting to establish himself as a respectable businessman. Without the infrastructure of a small captive town, he was considerably less formidable. Redemption Creek exhaled. Stella told Matthew she was expecting their first child on a February morning in 1885, sitting across the kitchen table from him with the morning coffee and the particular look on her face that he had learned to read as meaning she had something significant to say. He was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than she expected. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, those careful, certain hands, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was beyond joy, something she didn't have a word for. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Some," she said honestly. "You?" "Extremely," he said. "Also," he paused. "I've never been happier in my life." "That can be both things at once," she said. "Yes," he said, and brought her hands to his lips and held them there. Their son was born in late September of 1885, which gave them 8 months of expectation and preparation, and the particular closeness of two people building towards something together. Matthew built a proper cradle. He had learned woodworking from one of the men in town, with a patience that Stella found both admirable and slightly amusing, since he had approached it with the same methodical precision he brought to legal briefs. The cradle was very good, better than very good. It was the kind of cradle that would last through multiple children. Stella noticed this and chose not to comment on it yet. They named the boy James after Stella's father. Matthew had suggested it without any preamble. One evening in June, while they were sitting on the porch and she had been talking about her father's investment and what he had hoped for, and how she thought about him when she walked the land. He had simply said, "If it's a boy, James." And she had looked at him and thought, for perhaps the 1000th time, that she had not known it was possible to love someone this specifically. James Monroe Yates arrived on a Sunday, and the birth was attended by Mrs. Abigail Torres, who was the town's most experienced midwife, and by Clara Hutchins, who had made herself indispensable in the preparation period and was not about to absent herself from the actual event. Matthew was in the kitchen, which was the established and correct location for husbands during such proceedings, and he made tea 3 times and drank none of it. When Abigail Torres brought baby James to him, wrapped and red-faced and furiously alive, Matthew sat down very suddenly in the kitchen chair as though his legs had made a unilateral decision. He held his son with the same careful certainty he brought to everything important, and looked at this small face that was somehow part him and part Stella, and did not say anything for a long time. Stella from the bedroom heard the silence and called, "Matthew, tell me what you see," he said. "He has your nose." His voice was strange and thick. "Heaven help him," she said. She heard him laugh, that rare, complete, genuine laugh, and felt herself smile so wide it almost hurt. Clara Hutchins stayed for 3 days to help, which she said was purely practical, and which everyone understood to be love. On the morning of the 2nd day, she told Matthew, in the kitchen while Stella slept, that she had known from the first Thursday dinner that this was going to happen, and that she was very pleased about it, and that she expected to be consulted about the name of the next one. Matthew looked at her with an expression that was equally amused and fond. "We'll keep that in mind," he said. James grew with the particular determination of a child who has decided to be present in every moment, alert, curious, opinionated from surprisingly early, with dark eyes that were clearly Matthew's and an expressiveness that was clearly Stella's, and a combination of the two that kept both parents in a state of exhausted delight. By the time he was old enough to sit up reliably, he had established strong opinions about everything in his immediate environment and communicated them with startling efficiency for someone without language. "He's already arguing," Matthew said one evening, watching James make an emphatic case to a wooden block. "He learned from good examples," Stella said. Matthew looked at her sideways. "Are you including yourself in that assessment?" "I'm the reason we own this land," she said pleasantly. "You are," he agreed, with the particular warmth that still appeared in his voice when he said things like that, even 3 years into their marriage. As though he had not quite gotten used to the fact of her, Redemption Creek changed through those years. The railroad extension did come through the territory, though the route shifted slightly north of the Monroe land, which meant they sold a right-of-way easement for a modest sum rather than being displaced. The town grew new families, a new school that needed a teacher. Stella taught there 2 days a week once James was old enough to accompany her and sit in the corner with a slate board and his considerable opinions. The schoolchildren adored him, and he adored the attention. Matthew's practice grew with the town. He took on a young man named Ethan Cole as a clerk in 1887, a serious-faced boy of 22 from a farm outside of town who wanted to study law and whom Matthew agreed to teach, because he remembered what it was to be given a chance. Ethan was meticulous and honest, and sometimes reminded Stella, in the best possible way, of a younger version of Matthew before the Philadelphia years had added their weight. In the spring of 1888, Stella told Matthew she was expecting again, and his response was essentially the same as the first time: quiet, then that expression, then both her hands held carefully. "Clara is going to want to help name this one," he reminded her. Stella laughed. "I know, I'm prepared to negotiate." Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1888, the week of the presidential election that put Benjamin Harrison in the White House, which Matthew found historically interesting and Stella found personally irrelevant given what was happening in her kitchen at the time. They named her Eliza, a name they had arrived at together without Clara's input, which Clara accepted with the grace of someone who understood she had already won the larger argument by being present for everything. Eliza was dark-haired like James and like Matthew, and she had the Monroe jaw set and determined, and she was quieter than her brother but no less convinced of her own views. By the time she was 2, the household had a specific quality of managed creative chaos that Stella found exhausting and also deeply, completely right. Matthew found a letter in his own pocket one morning in the spring of 1889, the kind of morning where everything was good and ordinary and right. James at school. Eliza pulling herself up against the furniture with the focused determination of someone who has decided that walking is a hill worth dying on. Stella at the kitchen table going over accounts with the quick, precise competence she brought to everything practical. The letter was from Daniel, his brother in Ohio, whom he had not seen since coming west. It invited them both, all of them, the whole family, to come east that summer for a visit. It was the first time Daniel had asked in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory, the first time Matthew thought the invitation was actually meant. He put the letter on the table in front of Stella and watched her read it. She looked up at him. "Ohio," she said. "I know," he said. "It's far. James has never been east of the Rio Grande." "I know." She thought for a moment, tapping the letter with one finger in the way she had when she was deciding something. "You want to go?" "I haven't seen Daniel in 7 years," he said. "And my sisters, my youngest sister," he paused. "She would have been 14 when I left. She's 21 now." Stella looked at him with that particular attention she brought to the things that mattered, the kind that made him feel fully seen in a way he had spent most of his life not knowing he needed. "We'll go," she said. "In July, when school is out. We'll take the children and stay for 3 weeks and you will show me where you grew up." He sat down beside her at the table without preamble and kissed her in the morning sunlight fully and deliberately, with both hands on her face the way he had the very first time, as though some gestures were worth keeping exactly as they were. "I love you," he said against her lips. And then, obviously. She pulled back just enough to look at him with that sparkling, precise amusement that was one of his favorite expressions on her face. "You've been practicing," she said. 7 years of practice," he said. "I'm getting better." "You were always good," she said. They went to Ohio in July of 1889, all 4 of them. The first long journey they had taken as a family, 3 days on the train because Eliza was 18 months old, and trains with small children took longer than trains without them. A fact that James found entirely fair and reasonable since he had made friends with the conductor by the second day and been given a tour of the engine, which he described in exhaustive detail for the remainder of the journey. Matthew's family received them with a warmth that Stella had not known quite what to expect, and which turned out to be genuine and uncomplicated. Daniel was Matthew's height but broader, with a louder laugh and less reserve, and he and Stella understood each other almost immediately, which made Matthew quietly and visibly relieved. The sisters, 2 of them, Elena and Rose, now 27 and 21, fussed over James and Eliza with a warmth that made the children immediately comfortable, and they sat with Stella in the evenings and talked with the easy directness of women who were comfortable with themselves. Matthew's mother was alive. His father had died 3 years earlier, which was a grief Matthew had carried quietly, and Stella understood, somewhat alone, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 62 who looked at Stella for approximately 45 seconds upon their arrival and then put her hand on Stella's arm and said, "He was always so careful. I worried he would be careful forever. I'm glad you found him." Stella looked at Matthew, who had turned slightly pink in a way she treasured, and said, "He found me mostly." "No," Matthew's mother said firmly. "That's not how it worked. I can tell." Stella conceded the point. They spent 3 weeks in Ohio, and Stella watched Matthew become, by small degrees, a slightly different version of himself, still Matthew, still careful and precise and methodical and deeply himself, but with layers restored that the hard years and the difficult crossing had worn down. He laughed more often in that house. He talked about his father with the steady, sad honesty of someone finally being allowed to grieve properly. He let his sisters bully him affectionately and retaliated in kind, and was clearly, fundamentally nourished by it. On the last evening before they returned west, he and Stella sat on Daniel's porch in the warm Ohio dark while the children slept inside, and he held her hand and looked at the fireflies in the long grass and said, "Thank you for coming." "You didn't have to thank me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You should come back more often," she said. "They need you." "We live 4 days away by train," he said. "That's not a reason, that's a distance." She paused. "We can afford it twice a year, once in summer and once before the winter closes the passes." He was quiet. She felt the quality of his quiet thinking, not resisting. "You've already planned this," he said. "I made a preliminary assessment," she said. He laughed, soft and full in the dark. "Of course you did." They came home to Redemption Creek in August, to the house that was now entirely their own in every way, the furniture chosen together, the garden established by Stella's hands, the cradle in the children's room that had proved, as she had suspected, useful for multiple occupants. They came home to the practice and the school and the familiar faces and the land that had started all of it. Her father's land that now had cattle on it and a proper fence and a hand-painted sign at the road that said Monroe Creek Ranch, because Stella had decided to name it after the creek that ran along the southern edge, and because the Monroe name should stand for something in this territory that had taken so much from her family. Hector Crane, they heard through various channels, had died in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1889. A heart attack, sudden, alone, in the modest house he had retreated to. There was no eulogy that reached Redemption Creek. There was only the quiet information, passed through the network of people who had watched him operate for years, and a silence afterward that was not exactly grief. Matthew told Stella and said nothing else, and she looked out the window at the November land for a moment and then said, "I hope whatever drove him to all of it found some peace at the end." Matthew considered this. "That's more generous than he deserved," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "But I'm choosing it anyway." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued since the beginning, the one that was all the things he had ever felt for her distilled into a single look. "I know," he said. "That's one of approximately 40 reasons I love you." "Only 40, she said. "I'm still counting," he said. The decade that followed was the kind of decade that, when you looked back on it, you understood had been the substance of a life rather than the preparation for one. Not the dramatic part, the trial, the fire, the letter, the proposal in the ash, but the daily accumulated reality of a marriage that worked because both people in it had chosen it with full knowledge and kept choosing it. Matthew continued to practice law and to teach Ethan Cole, who by 1893 had passed his bar examination in Santa Fe and opened his own small practice in the next town over, from which he sent Matthew an extremely formal and slightly emotional letter of thanks that Matthew read 3 times and kept in the iron cabinet with the important documents. Stella taught school through the early 1890s, stopping when their 3rd child arrived in 1892, another son, dark-eyed and determined like his father and sister, whom they named William after Matthew's father. Clara Hutchins, who had retained her interest in the Yates family's naming conventions with undiminished enthusiasm, approved of William warmly, though she noted that she would have suggested her late husband's name, Henry, if anyone had thought to consult her. "We'll keep that in mind for the next one," Stella said. The next, Clara began. "I'm speaking hypothetically," Stella said. Clara's expression said clearly that she did not consider this hypothetical at all, and she was, as it happened, correct. Their fourth child arrived in 1894, another girl, and she was named Clara, and the original Clara Hutchins was present at the birth and held the baby with an expression that was so simple and pure that no one in the room said anything for a full minute. "You named her after me," Clara said finally, in a voice that was not quite steady. "You were here from the beginning," Stella said. "It seemed right." Matthew was watching this from the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, and that expression warm and private and entirely his on his face. When Clara finally looked up and saw him watching, she gave him a look that said, very clearly, that she credited him with this decision. He gave a very small, very Matthew shrug that said, equally clearly, that it had been Stella's idea entirely. Clara gave him a look that said she knew perfectly well whose idea it had been, and appreciated him pretending otherwise. The house on the Monroe land expanded once more in 1895 to accommodate 4 children, a proper second floor, with a staircase instead of the original ladder to the sleeping loft, and 2 additional bedrooms up there that gave everyone significantly more peace. The Monroe Creek Ranch had 30 head of cattle by then and was modestly profitable, managed by a man named Rodrigo Martinez, who had come to the territory from Chihuahua 10 years earlier, and who knew cattle the way Matthew knew legal text, not from books but from deep, patient attention. Rodrigo and his wife, Esperanza, lived in a small house at the far end of the land, and their children and the Yates children constituted an entity that moved through both properties with the energy of a small weather system. Matthew's visits to Ohio had become, as Stella had planned from Daniel's porch, a twice-yearly institution. He was different after each return rested in some specific way that went deeper than the ordinary tiredness of work and children. Stella understood that there were parts of a person's history that only certain places and people could reach, and she was not jealous of Ohio. She was glad of it, the way she was glad of everything that made him more wholly himself. In the spring of 1897, Matthew found her in the garden on a Tuesday morning. She had taken up gardening with the serious intensity she brought to everything, the garden now occupying the south side of the porch and providing them with vegetables through the summer and into fall, and he sat down on the porch steps and watched her work for a moment. She looked up from the seeds she was pressing into the turned earth. "What is it?" "Nothing bad," he said, which had become his opening for significant conversations ever since she had once told him that his way of beginning serious topics made her immediately assume catastrophe. "All right," she said, and sat back on her heels and waited. "I've been offered something," he said, "a position, territorial associate judge. There's a seat opening in the district court, Judge Hartwell's district. He's retiring." Stella was still. "The territorial governor asked me last week," Matthew continued. "I haven't given an answer. I wanted to talk to you first." She looked at him sitting on the porch steps of the house her father had bought and she had fought for, and they had built together, in the morning light of a spring Tuesday. And she thought about his father, who had been a circuit judge, and how Matthew had grown up watching the law practiced at the highest level of local authority, and how everything about him, the precision, the patience, the absolute refusal to be moved by anything other than evidence, had been preparing him for exactly this. "You want it," she said. "I do," he said, "but it would mean more time away, circuit duties, riding district." "We managed before," she said, "when you went to Las Cruces and Santa Fe." "This would be more frequent," he said, "and more permanent." Stella pressed another seed into the earth, feeling the specific weight of its small, potentialful patient. "Matthew," she said, "your father was a judge. You've been practicing for 15 years. This is what all of it has been for." He was quiet. "Take it," she said. "The children are old enough. The ranch is running. I managed Hector Crane before I had half the resources I have now." She looked at him directly. "Take it." That expression, the complete one, the one she could still stop her heart with after 15 years. "You're sure?" he said. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said, "except saying yes when you asked me to marry you in a ruined building covered in ash." He laughed full, unguarded, the laugh she had spent 15 years accumulating. He came down off the porch steps and crouched beside her in the garden and kissed her in the turned earth in the spring morning, and it was completely undignified and exactly right. Matthew Yates was appointed territorial associate judge in July of 1897. He took the appointment with the same quiet certainty that characterized every significant thing he had ever done, and he was, by every account that reached them through official and unofficial channels, very good at it. He had always been good at weighing evidence. He had always been good at seeing the truth under the pressure of argument. And he had, in 15 years of practicing in a territory where power had attempted to overrule justice on a regular basis, developed a deep and particular commitment to the principle that the law existed to protect the people it governed, not the people who governed. He rode his circuit through the district, which meant weeks away on a regular basis, which was hard in the ways she had known it would be. But he wrote her letters on those circuits careful, detailed, full of the precise observations and honest self-disclosures that were his particular language, the language she had been reading since she found his script on that terrible and wonderful November letter. She wrote back with equal care. Their letters crossed each other on the road like two people passing in opposite directions and stopping to say everything important. James, at 15 in 1900, was reading the law books on his father's shelves with an attention that needed no encouragement. Matthew said nothing about this for months, let it develop without pressure, and then one evening sat down with his son and answered questions for 2 hours with the same patient, exact attention he had given Stella's questions in a harness shop office in the spring of 1882. Stella stood in the doorway of the study and watched them across the table, dark heads bent together over the same text, and felt something that was beyond happiness, something quieter and more permanent, the particular satisfaction of a life that had arrived where it was always going. Eliza, at 12, had announced an interest in teaching, which Stella received with complex pride, because she had loved teaching and because she wanted more for her daughter than her own options had been, and because she knew that by the time Eliza was grown, what a woman could do with a teaching education might be different. She told Eliza this carefully and honestly, and Eliza received it with the Monroe jaw set at its most characteristic angle, and said she intended to find out. William, at 8, was intensely interested in cattle, and had developed an excellent working relationship with Rodrigo Martinez that was producing a small natural rancher. He had also, Stella noted, inherited her habit of making preliminary assessments before committing to a plan, which was deeply gratifying. Clara named for Clara Hutchins, who had gone gently in the winter of 1898 at the age of 76, having seen the fourth Yates child reach 4 years old, and having expressed complete satisfaction with how everything had turned out. Clara was 6 and already reading, which in the Yates household was entirely standard and not considered remarkable. The original Clara Hutchins had left her boarding house to a niece in Albuquerque, who had come and sold it and gone again. The building had been purchased by a young couple who were converting it into a proper hotel with 6 rooms, which Redemption Creek, growing as it was, could now use. The world of the territory was changing. The railroad had come closer. Commerce was different. The old wild edges of the frontier were smoothing themselves toward something more settled. But the Monroe land, Monroe Creek Ranch, still ran along the creek with its cottonwoods and the sound of moving water, and the house was solid and full. And on summer evenings, the family gathered on the south porch that Stella had designed with specific attention to the way the evening light fell. And there was something in those hours, the children's voices, The smell of Esperanza Martinez's cooking drifting from the end of the land. The sound of Matthew's boots on the porch boards as he came out with coffee. That felt like the exact thing that was supposed to exist. 15 years of chosen mornings. 15 years of deliberately said I love yous. Of notes in careful handwriting left on kitchen tables. Of Thursday dinners that had expanded to include children and hired hands and visiting relations. Of legal briefs written in the study while bread rose in the kitchen. Of a marriage that had been built the same way Matthew built everything, with exact attention to every joint and corner, with patience for the slow work, with a refusal to cut corners even when it would have been easy. On the 15th anniversary of their wedding, Matthew gave her a letter. He set it on the breakfast table without comment while the children were doing their morning things and she was standing at the stove, and he said, "When you get a moment," and left the room. She found it when she sat down with her coffee, her name on the front in his handwriting, that careful, deliberate script she had known for 16 years by then, that she would know under any circumstances, in any light, at any distance. She opened it. It was long, several pages, which was unusual even for him. It was a reckoning. A careful, honest accounting of 15 years as he had experienced them. Not a list of events, but a meditation on what she had given him. The return of his faith in his own judgment, the proof that some things did not repeat their worst versions, the daily specific joy of being known by someone who chose to keep knowing you. He wrote about James reading the law books. He wrote about Clara growing up with the name of a woman who had stood for goodness in both their lives. He wrote about the morning he had come back from Santa Fe with the survey evidence and found that something in him had decided, in those 5 days of absence, that fear was no longer a good enough reason to keep the most important thing unsaid. He wrote, "The letter I sent you before we were married, the one you almost threw away, I wrote that letter because I was afraid you did not have the full truth and therefore could not make a real choice. I have spent 15 years watching you make real choices, fully informed, with both eyes open and your jaw set. And I need you to know that nothing you have ever chosen has made me prouder or more certain that whatever I was made for, I was made to spend my life alongside you." Stella put the letter down on the table. Outside the window, November light was laying gold across the Monroe Creek land. In the next room she could hear James explaining something complicated to Eliza with the particular earnest gravity he brought to education. William was somewhere outside with the dogs, from the sound of it. Young Clara was still asleep, being a person of decisive opinions about morning hours. Matthew was in his study. She could hear his pen. She stood up, left the letter on the table, crossed the house, and opened the study door. He looked up from his desk. He saw her face. He set the pen down. "The letter," she said. "Yes," he said. "You never stop, do you?" she said. "Writing them, when things matter." "Writing is where I'm most honest," he said. She crossed the room and sat down on the edge of his desk, which she had done periodically for 15 years, and which he had pretended to object to for 15 years, and which they both understood was not going to stop. She looked at him at close range. Matthew Yates, 45 years old, still dark-haired but with gray at his temples now that she found devastatingly distinguished, still with those direct eyes and the jaw cut from mesa stone and the careful hands that were never careless with anything that mattered. "I love you," she said. "You know that." "I do," he said. "I also know that you have 43 reasons and are still counting." She laughed. He stood up from his chair and put his arms around her the way he had from the beginning, completely, with nothing held back, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to him breathing and felt the 15 years of it, all of it. The letter in her hands that had nearly been thrown away, the ash of the burned office, the Thursday dinners, the Ohio summer, the 4 children, the garden, the courthouse, the circuit rides, the letters that crossed on the road, all of it. The whole constructed weight of a life built together with patience and honesty, and the particular stubborn conviction that 2 people who chose each other well and kept choosing could make something that lasted. The Monroe Creek Ranch ran for another 40 years. James studied law, was admitted to the bar in 1908, and practiced in Redemption Creek, where his father had eventually taken over the office where Matthew had once sat behind the organized stacks of paper on the day Stella Monroe walked in with her father's deed. Eliza taught school, first in Redemption Creek and then in the larger school in the county seat, and she lived to see the options available to her students expand in ways she had told herself to expect and was still surprised by when they came. William ran the ranch with Rodrigo Martinez's son Diego after Rodrigo retired, and he ran it well, with the quiet competence of a person who understood the land as something you had responsibility toward rather than ownership over. Clara, youngest and most decisive, became a school teacher like her sister, then a school administrator, then one of the first women appointed to the Territorial Education Board in New Mexico when it became a state in 1912, which Stella received with the particular fierce pride of a mother watching her child do the thing she was built for. Matthew served as a territorial associate judge for 11 years, retiring in 1908 at the same time that James took the bar, as though one generation ending something was the condition for the next one beginning. He was 60 years old at his retirement and entirely well, and he spent the years that followed in a version of each day that Stella privately thought was the life he had always been meant to have, rising early, writing, reading, riding the Monroe land on a horse that was considerably more docile than his earlier choices, sitting on the south porch in the evening with coffee and the sound of the cottonwoods. They grew old together the way they had always done everything together, with honest attention, without pretense, choosing each other in the particular daily way of two people who had started with a conscious decision and found it deepening into something that required no decision at all, only gratitude. In the last year of his life, Matthew wrote Stella a final letter. He left it on the kitchen table on a morning when he was well, not ill, not expecting anything, just moved by some accounting impulse toward the record. He had always been a man who understood the importance of documentation. She found it when she came in from the garden, and she sat down with her coffee and read his careful handwriting one more time, and it said what it had always said, the essential thing beneath all the precise words: I am yours. I have been since approximately the 3rd week of April, 1882. I will be long after this paper is dust. She folded it carefully. She placed it in the iron cabinet with the important documents, with the Monroe land deed, with the survey evidence, with the ethics board dismissal, with the letters they had written each other through all the circuit years, and she closed the cabinet door. Then she went to find him on the south porch, because that was where he would be, because that was where they always ended up, in the light they had designed the porch to hold. He was there. He looked up when she came out, and his face did the thing, that expression, unchanged by 40 years, still all of it, still just him looking at her as though she were the most interesting and important thing in his range of vision, which she understood she would go to her grave considering the greatest gift she had ever received. She sat down beside him and took his hand, and the cottonwoods moved along the creek, and the Monroe land lay quiet and golden and entirely theirs, and the life they had built on it, from a fraudulent deed and a burned office, and a letter she had almost thrown away, from the ash and the April sunlight and the Thursday dinners and all the careful words, was solid around them, and it held.